Nobody had crossed the rancher's gate in 6 years, until a widow returned his horse. Wade Branson didn't knock. He never knocked. He shoved open the door to the county assessor's office like he owned the building, because in Harlan County, most people believed he did, and he slapped a folded document down on the desk hard enough to rattle the inkwell. "Sign it," he said. "Date it yesterday." The assessor, a thin man named Purcell, who had a wife and 3 daughters and a mortgage he couldn't quite cover, looked at the paper. His hands went still. "Wade, this transfers the water rights for the entire North Creek corridor. Gideon Mercer's name is already—" "I know whose name is on it." Branson leaned forward, both fists on the desk. "That's why you're going to fix it." Purcell's mouth opened, then closed, and that was how Harlan County worked. If you've ever watched someone powerful take something from someone who had nothing left to lose, then you already know this story. But stay with me, because what happened next at Blackstone Ranch is the kind of thing that people in this valley still talk about when they think nobody is listening. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The stallion came back on a Tuesday. Gideon Mercer didn't see it happen. He was in the barn, same as most mornings, doing the kind of work that keeps a man's hands busy when his mind needs somewhere quiet to go. He'd been doing a lot of that for 6 years. Moving hay, checking water lines, fixing things that weren't broken yet, because fixing things that were already broken reminded him of everything he couldn't fix. Ranger had been gone 11 days. 11 days since the fence along the east pasture had come down in that night storm, and Gideon's best horse, the one Eleanor had named the morning they brought him home as a colt, the one that still came to Gideon's whistle the way she used to come to his voice from the other room, had walked off into the dark and not come back. Gideon had searched 4 days before he made himself stop. He told himself Ranger was gone, same way he told himself Eleanor was gone, and that the only thing left to do was keep moving. He heard the dog first, a short, sharp bark from somewhere near the front of the property. Then another. Then the unmistakable sound of hooves on packed dirt. Not panicked hooves, not the stumbling gait of a horse that had been running for days. Steady, unhurried, like something coming home. Gideon set down the pitchfork and walked to the barn door. There was a woman leading Ranger up the road toward his gate. He stood there for a moment just watching, because his brain needed a second to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. Ranger was alive. Ranger was walking, and the person leading him was— He pushed the gate open before she reached it. She was large. That was the first thing anyone would have noticed, and Gideon wasn't in the habit of pretending otherwise or making apologies for plain observation. She was a heavy-set woman, broad through the shoulders and heavier through the middle, wearing a dark wool dress that had been mended in several places and a pair of boots that had seen at least 3 hard winters. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands coming free along her temples from what had obviously been a long walk. She was maybe 40, maybe a little older. It was hard to say. Her face had the look of a person who had lived in it without much shelter. Beside her walked a boy, 10, maybe 11, with his mother's same dark hair and his father's absence written quietly all over him in the way boys that age sometimes carry things they don't have words for yet. And at her heels, trotting with the confident self-importance of a dog who believed he had personally organized the entire expedition, was the scruffiest animal Gideon had seen in years. One ear stood up straight, the other flopped sideways. There was a scar running through the fur above its left eye. It looked like something that had argued with the world repeatedly and intended to keep arguing. The woman stopped when she reached the open gate. She didn't come through it. Gideon appreciated that. "This your horse?" she asked. Her voice was steady. Not the careful, apologetic steadiness of someone waiting to be told they'd done something wrong. Just steady. "Yes, ma'am," Gideon said. He looked at Ranger. The stallion was thinner than he should have been. 11 days of open country would do that. But he wasn't limping, and his eyes were clear. Gideon reached out and ran a hand along the horse's neck, and Ranger pushed into it the way he always did, and something tightened unexpectedly in Gideon's chest. "Found him about 6 miles east near the old Drummond water crossing," the woman said. "Hind shoes were loose. Wrapped the left one with what I had. It'll hold until a farrier sees him, but you shouldn't wait more than a day or 2. Gideon looked at the hoof. She'd wrapped it with a strip of leather, secured with a doubled length of cord, tight enough to keep the shoe from pulling away without cutting off circulation. It was a competent job, more than competent. "That's good work," he said. She looked at him like she wasn't quite sure if he was making fun of her. "I mean it," he said. "How'd you know to do it that way?" "My father had horses," she said, "and a bad habit of letting the shoeing go too long." She paused. "I'm Martha Calloway. This is my son, Owen." The boy nodded. He was watching the one-eared dog, who was now sitting very still and staring at Gideon with what appeared to be professional evaluation. "Gideon Mercer." He looked down at the dog. "What's that one's name?" "Judge," Owen said immediately. "Does he judge fairly?" Owen considered this seriously. "Mostly. He doesn't like people who yell." "Can't argue with that," Gideon said. He looked back at Martha. She had the particular posture of a person who has been standing in doorways their whole life. Not quite in, not quite out, waiting to see whether they were going to be welcomed or turned back. "Where are you headed?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. She looked out past the barn, across the property, with the measured look of someone doing a quiet calculation. "Wherever there's work," she said finally. That was when Gideon noticed the wagon. It was sitting about 100 yards back down the road, tilted at an angle that told the whole story before he'd taken 3 steps toward it. The left rear wheel had cracked through the hub. Not bent, not just worn, cracked clean through in a way that no roadside repair was going to fix. The wagon bed held everything Martha Calloway owned in the world. 2 trunks, a bedroll, a cast iron pot, a crate of tools, and a canvas sack that Owen had been carrying the strap of when they walked up. Gideon stood there looking at it. Behind him, he heard Owen ask the dog something in a low voice, and heard the dog make a sound back, which was not a thing dogs generally did, but apparently Judge had opinions. "That wheel's finished," Gideon said. "I know," Martha said. She was standing beside him now. She'd come through the gate at some point without him noticing, which meant she'd made that calculation. "Nearest wheelwright is in Harlan, 12 miles west," he said. "I know that too." He looked at her. "I passed through Harlan 3 days ago," she said. "The wheelwright there. Dobbins. He wanted $4 for the wheel and another 2 for the work. I don't have $6. How much do you have?" She didn't flinch. 73 cents. He thought about this. The honest thing to do, the neighborly thing, Eleanor would have said, was simple. But Gideon Mercer had spent 6 years being very careful about the distance between simple and complicated. "There's an old line shack on the east edge of the property," he said. "Backside of the first pasture. It's not much. Roof doesn't leak, but the floor's cold and the stove needs a new damper. I could use someone to help with the east fence line this week. That same storm that took Ranger down took about 40 yards of fence with it." Martha was quiet for a moment. "I can fix fence," she said. "What's the pay?" "Use of the shack, use of the kitchen garden, and $1 a week if the work's honest. Once you've saved enough, Dobbins will fix your wheel. He's slow, but he does fair work." She looked at him for a long moment. Not with gratitude. He'd offered it like a transaction, and she was receiving it the same way, which was the only way he knew how to do things anymore. "All right," she said. That was it. No thank you, no effusion. Just all right, and she turned and went back to the wagon to start unloading. Owen followed her, then paused and looked back at Gideon. "She's a good worker," the boy said, like he needed Gideon to know that before things went any further. "I figured," Gideon said. The line shack was worse than Gideon remembered. He'd said the roof didn't leak, and technically that was true, but he hadn't been inside in 2 years and hadn't remembered the gap under the east-facing door or the way the cold came up through the plank floor like it had a personal grievance. Martha didn't say a word about any of it. She walked through, looked at the stove, opened its door and peered at the damper, pressed on the walls in a couple of places to check for rot, and then turned around and said, "We'll be fine." Owen was already on the floor showing Judge the corners of the room, narrating the tour in a low voice. Gideon brought over a cord of wood from the main barn stack, a spare oil lamp, and a quilt from the chest in the bunkhouse that hadn't been used since the last hand left 3 years ago. He set them on the shack's small porch and didn't go inside. "Damper parts are in the tack room," he said through the door. "Second shelf, left side. Take what you need." Martha appeared in the doorway. She had her sleeves rolled up already, hair tied back now in a way that meant business. I'll fix it tomorrow morning before we start on the fence, she said. All right. He was turning to leave when she said, without particular weight, Mr. Mercer. He stopped. Thank you, she said. Not the way people said it when they were embarrassed about needing something. The way people said it when they meant it exactly once and didn't intend to repeat it. He nodded and walked back to the main house. What? She fixed the damper in 40 minutes. Gideon heard the clanking from the kitchen while he was having his coffee, and he watched through the window as she came out of the tack room with the replacement parts and went directly into the shack without hesitation. No fussing. No checking the instructions that he'd never had instructions for, having learned the thing by doing it himself the hard way. 40 minutes later, smoke started coming up straight out of the shack's chimney. Owen came out of the shack shortly after that and walked across the yard to where Gideon was standing near the gate. She says we're ready, the boy announced. Tell her I'll meet her at the east fence in 10 minutes. Owen squinted at him. You could just walk over and tell her yourself. I could, Gideon agreed. Judge says you're not as mean as you look, Owen offered. Gideon looked down at the dog, who was sitting at the boy's feet, and looking back up at him with what did, in fact, appear to be a revised professional assessment. Well, Gideon said, you tell Judge I said thanks. The east fence was bad. 40 yards of it had come down in the storm, and that was just the section he could see easily. When Martha walked it with him that first morning, she found 2 additional sections he'd missed. One where a post had rotted at the base and was being held up entirely by the wire tension, and another where the wire itself had rusted through and was one good season from failing on its own. She didn't announce these findings with any fanfare. She just pointed at the post and said, "This one's got to come out. You've got maybe a month on it," and moved on. Gideon had been ranching for 20 years. He'd looked at that post last spring and thought it was fine. "How do you know it's rotted through?" he asked. "The surface looks solid." Martha crouched down and pressed her thumb hard against the base of the post, just at the soil line. The wood gave in a way healthy wood didn't. "Feels punky," she said. "You can't always see it, but you can always feel it if you press where it meets the ground." She stood back up. "My father taught me that. He said the ground always takes what it's owed, and there's no point arguing with it." Gideon looked at the post again. "Your father was a rancher?" "Sheep farmer, Wyoming." She was already moving to the next section. "Different kind of fence, same kind of ground." He followed her. They worked without a lot of conversation that first day, which suited Gideon fine. He was not a man who needed noise to feel comfortable in another person's company, and Martha appeared to be similarly built. She worked steadily, without complaint, and without the particular performance of effort that some workers put on when they wanted you to notice how hard they were trying. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She was just working. Owen appeared mid-morning with a canteen and a biscuit wrapped in cloth for each of them, then sat on a nearby rock with Judge and watched quietly. "He doesn't talk much," Gideon said, low enough that the boy wouldn't hear. "He talks plenty," Martha said. "He just doesn't talk to people he doesn't know yet." "How long does that take?" Martha thought about it. "He told you Judge approved of you this morning. That's about as fast as he's ever gone." The neighbors noticed her inside a week. That was the thing about a ranch that had been closed off for 6 years. People paid attention to changes. Gideon had gotten used to being invisible, or at least being left alone, which in Harlan County amounted to the same thing most of the time. But a strange woman appearing on Blackstone property, visible from the main road when she was working the east fence, visible again when she was in the kitchen garden, that backed up to the lane, that kind of thing traveled fast. It traveled fastest to the Branson place. Wade Branson's ranch sat 3 miles south of Blackstone and had been expanding steadily for a decade in the particular way of properties whose owners are less interested in working good land than in acquiring it. Wade was 45 years old, had the physical confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone with the power to make it stick, and had spent 6 years watching Blackstone Ranch operate at half capacity while its owner moved through the world like a man with 1 foot already out of it. Wade had made Gideon 2 offers on the property in the past 4 years. Both had been declined. Both times Wade had left with the pleasant certainty that eventually the right pressure applied at the right moment would change the calculation. He sent his ranch foreman, a flat-faced man named Cord Tillis, to take a look on the 3rd day. Tillis came back and reported that there was a big woman working the Blackstone fence line with Mercer himself, that she had a kid and a 1-eared dog, and that the fence work looked competent. Wade listened to this without visible reaction. Find out who she is, he said. Martha found out she was being watched on the fourth day. She didn't say how she knew. Gideon asked her later, and she just said she'd gotten used to it, which told him everything and nothing at the same time. She didn't change her behavior. She finished the fence section she was on, packed up her tools in the same deliberate way she always did, and walked back to the shack. That evening, Gideon was replacing a hinge on the main barn door when he heard her come up behind him. "Man on a gray horse," she said. "South fence line. He's been there about an hour." Gideon set down the hinge. "Tillis. He works for Branson." "Who's Branson?" He told her the short version. Wade Branson, South neighbor. Ambitious in the way that required other people's losses. Had been making quiet moves on Blackstone water rights for 2 years through the county assessor's office. Martha listened without interrupting. "What does he want with the ranch?" she asked. "The North Creek. It runs through the middle of this property before it hits Branson's east pasture. If he controls the water rights, he controls who can graze where in this whole section of valley. And if you sold—" "I'm not selling." She looked at him. Not like she was testing the statement, like she was reading the truth of it. "He's going to make trouble for you," she said, "because I'm here." "Probably." "You knew that before you offered me the shack." He didn't answer right away. "I needed the fence work done," he said finally. She looked at him for another second, then went back to the shack. On the 6th day, something happened with the horses. Gideon was doing the evening feeding when he noticed Ranger standing at the far end of the paddock, apart from the other 3 horses, with his head low. Not injured low, thinking low. The kind of stance Gideon had learned to pay attention to over the years. He went into the paddock and ran his hands over the stallion, checking the usual places. Nothing. No heat in the joints, no tenderness along the belly, no labored breathing. But Ranger wouldn't eat. He tried 2 different feeds. Nothing. He checked the water trough. Clean. He'd been off his hay that morning too, and Gideon had told himself it was the adjustment from 11 days on open pasture. He was still crouched next to the trough, trying to think through what he might be missing when Martha appeared at the paddock fence. She didn't speak. She just looked at Ranger for a long moment. Then she climbed through the fence. Not over it, through it, moving with the particular practicality of a large woman who had made peace with not doing things elegantly and simply doing them, and walked slowly toward the stallion. Ranger lifted his head. She didn't reach for him right away. She stopped about 4 feet away and stood there, and the horse looked at her, and something passed between them that Gideon couldn't name. Then she took 1 step closer and put the back of her hand near his muzzle. Ranger breathed on it. She moved around to his right side and pressed her ear gently against his flank, listening. "Gut sounds are off," she said quietly. "Not colic, not yet, but his digestion is slowed." She moved her hands carefully along his belly. He ate something out there that didn't agree with him. Wild plants sometimes do that to a horse that's been on good hay. His body needs a day or 2 to work through it. "What do I do?" Gideon asked. "Bran mash tonight, small amount. Keep him moving. Don't let him stand still for long." She stepped back from the horse. "And check him at midnight. If he starts pawing the ground or looking at his flank, wake me up." Gideon looked at her. "You've done this before." "Twice," she said. "Both times it was fine when we caught it early." "And when you didn't catch it early?" She met his eyes. "Let's not find out," she said. She climbed back through the fence and walked toward the shack, and Ranger watched her go with an expression that, in a man, you would have called gratitude. Gideon checked the stallion at midnight. He was eating, carefully, but eating. On the 9th day, Cord Tillis rode through the open gate of Blackstone Ranch without being invited. Gideon was at the water trough at the time, which was perhaps 70 yards from the barn, and had a clear line of sight to the main gate. He saw Tillis come in and kept watching while the foreman rode slowly toward the barn, head moving as he took inventory. Martha came out of the barn before Gideon reached it. She was holding a curry comb and had a smear of something across her left forearm that was probably saddle soap. She stood in the barn doorway and looked at Tillis the way Judge looked at strangers, with perfect stillness that was somehow louder than barking. Tillis pulled up. "Looking for Mercer," he said. "He's coming," Martha said. She didn't move. Tillis looked her over with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had been sent specifically to look her over. He took in her size, her worn dress, her boots, the curry comb. He let the looking go on longer than it needed to. "You work here?" he asked. Yes. Mercer hire you? Yes. Hmm. He let that sit. Mr. Branson had a question about the woman up here at Blackstone. Wanted to know if she had any livestock of her own, any animals she'd brought from other places. Martha looked at him. That's not a question. Tillis blinked. What? You said Mr. Branson had a question, but you didn't ask one. You made a statement. Do you have a question or not? Gideon arrived at that moment, coming around the side of the barn. He'd caught the last piece of it. Tillis shifted in his saddle. Just checking in, he said to Gideon now, recalibrating. Mr. Branson's heard there's a new woman up here with livestock of unknown origin. He's just being careful about the valley. You know how it is. Disease can spread, Bussy. She doesn't have livestock, Gideon said. She has a dog, one dog. Still. Still what, Cord? Tillis smiled the way men smiled when they were carrying someone else's threat. Mr. Branson thought you might want to know that he filed a request with the county health office last month about movement of animals through the valley. Some kind of regulatory thing. He's just making sure everybody's following the rules. He turned his horse and rode out without waiting for an answer. Martha watched him go. She still hadn't moved from the barn doorway. That's the opening move, she said quietly. Gideon looked at her. What do you mean? She turned to go back into the barn. It means whatever's coming next, he's already started. She was right in a way neither of them could have predicted. 3 days later, one of the neighboring ranch hands came by Blackstone to borrow a piece of equipment, and while Gideon went to get it, the man stood in the yard and chatted with Owen, the way adults sometimes talk to children when they were actually trying to gather information without it looking like that. Owen was smart enough to recognize it. He didn't say anything, just answered politely, and came to find Gideon after the man left. He asked about the dog, Owen said, whether Judge had been anywhere near the parish place. The parish place is 4 miles east, Gideon said. I know. Owen scratched behind Judge's flopped ear. He said there's something wrong with some of the horses at Parrish's ranch and at the Kimball place. Gideon went very still. What kind of something wrong? Owen looked up at him. He didn't say, but he looked at Judge when he said it. Gideon found Martha in the kitchen garden and told her. She was quiet for a moment, kneeling over a row of late-season turnips, her hands still in the dirt. How many ranches are we talking about? She said. 2 so far. She stood up slowly, pressing on her knee the way she did when it had stiffened. She looked out past the fence line toward the direction of the parish spread. And it started how long ago? She asked. I don't know. He only said, find out, she said. Find out when the first animal showed symptoms and exactly which ranches are involved. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not worry, exactly. Something more forward-looking than worry, like she was already 3 steps ahead and didn't like what she was seeing. Do it quickly, Gideon, because if I'm right about what this is, we don't have a lot of time before it gets much worse. He looked at her. What do you think it is? She pressed her lips together for a moment. I think someone brought something into this valley, she said, and I think we're about to get blamed for it. The sun was going down behind the hill. Somewhere across the field, Judge barked once at something in the grass, then went quiet. Gideon looked at the line of fence they'd fixed together over the past 9 days, straight and solid, running east as far as he could see. Then he went to saddle a horse. Gideon rode to the parish place that same evening, just as the last of the light was going flat and gray over the western hills. Dale Parrish met him at the fence line, which told Gideon something right away. A man who met you at the fence instead of the door was a man who didn't want you coming any closer than necessary. Heard you might be coming, Dale said. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, with the particular squint of someone who had spent decades looking into wind. He didn't offer his hand. Owen told me there's something going around, Gideon said. I wanted to know what we're dealing with. What you're dealing with, Dale said, is a question of where it started. He leaned on the top rail of the fence and looked past Gideon toward the road. 3 of my mares are down. Started 4 days ago. Fever, swollen legs, won't eat. Kimball's got 2 horses showing the same thing, and I heard Aldridge lost one this morning. Gideon felt the weight of that settle on him. Aldridge was 7 miles north. If it had jumped that far already, this wasn't something contained. When did it start on your property? He asked. First sign was 10 days ago, Dale said. 1 mare seemed off. I thought she'd gotten into something. Then 4 days ago, it came on fast. 10 days ago. Gideon counted backward. That was 3 days before Martha Calloway had walked up his road with Ranger. He kept that calculation to himself. You called the county health office? He asked. Dale's expression shifted into something Gideon didn't like. Branson called them. On behalf of the valley, he said. On behalf of the valley, Gideon repeated. He's been around to most of the spreads. Organizing, he calls it. Says there needs to be a coordinated response. Dale finally looked at him directly. He also said you've got a woman up there who came from somewhere east, with animals. A dog, Gideon said. One dog. Branson says, I don't much care what Branson says, Dale. I'm asking you what you've seen with your own eyes. Dale was quiet for a moment. He pulled out a thread on his jacket cuff. I've seen sick horses, he said finally, and I've seen a lot of finger pointing, and none of it's making my mares any better. I need to know everything, Gideon said. Every ranch that's affected, and exactly when the first animal showed symptoms. Will you tell me that? Dale looked at him for a long moment. Why? Because I think someone who knows a good deal more about livestock disease than I do needs to see the pattern before the county inspectors come in and start making decisions based on whatever Branson's been telling them. Dale pulled at that thread again. It came loose, and he looked at it and tucked it into his pocket. Come back tomorrow morning, he said. I'll have it written down. Gideon rode home in the dark. Martha was waiting on the shack's small porch when he came back through the gate. She'd left a lamp in the window, and in its light he could see Owen had fallen asleep on the bench inside, Judge curled up against the boy's legs. What did he say? She asked, before Gideon had even dismounted. He told her everything. The number of ranches, the timeline, the progression. She listened without asking questions until he finished. 10 days before I got here, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. They won't care about that, she said. The timing doesn't matter if Branson's already decided what the story is. The timing matters if we can prove it. She looked up. And how do you plan to do that? I was hoping, Gideon said carefully, that you might have some thoughts on the matter. She was silent for a long beat. I need to see the sick horses, she said. Not from a fence line, up close. I need to know what we're actually dealing with before I start guessing at causes. Parrish won't let you near his property right now. I know. She leaned back against the post. What about Kimball? You know him well? Better than Parrish. We've traded fence work a few times. Try Kimball first, she said. Tell him you want to bring someone who knows livestock disease. Don't say who. If he says yes, we go first thing in the morning before anyone else is up and around. Gideon looked at her. You think it's that urgent? I think, she said, that whatever is making those horses sick, it's not going to wait for us to be careful about people's feelings. And I think whoever started this conversation about my dog being the source is counting on everyone being too scared to look closely at the actual evidence. She stood up, moving her weight off the knee that gave her trouble. I've been blamed for things I didn't do before, Gideon. I know what it looks like when someone gets their story set up early. He didn't answer that. There wasn't a good answer. I'll ride to Kimball's tonight, he said. She nodded and went inside. He was 3 steps toward the barn when she appeared in the doorway again. The symptoms you described, she said. Fever, swollen lower legs, loss of appetite. Has anyone mentioned sores? Anywhere on the mouth or hooves? Dale didn't say. Ask Kimball specifically, and look yourself if he lets you close enough. She paused. If there are sores, then I know what this is. And if I'm right about what it is, a dog had nothing to do with it, not even a little bit. She went back inside. Gideon stood in the yard for a moment, the lamplight from the window casting a long shadow across the dirt, and he thought about what it meant that the most useful person in this valley right now was someone who'd arrived with 73 cents and a broken wagon wheel. Then he saddled a fresh horse and rode to Kimball's. Bill Kimball answered the door in his union suit with a shotgun, which was how most ranchers in the valley greeted nighttime callers. And when he recognized Gideon, he put the gun behind the door and said, "Come in," and poured 2 cups of coffee that had been sitting on the stove since dinner and were now roughly the consistency of creek mud. Gideon drank his without complaint and asked about the horses. Kimball confirmed the swelling and fever, and when Gideon asked about sores, the man went quiet and then said yes, there were sores. Two of his mares had them along the gum line, and one had a split on the edge of the hoof that he'd assumed was from rough terrain, but that hadn't been healing the way it should. "I'll come tomorrow morning," Gideon said. "I want to bring someone to look at them, a woman who knows horses. She won't touch anything without asking you first." Kimball looked at him over the rim of the terrible coffee. "This the woman at your place?" he said. "Yes." "Branson says—" "I know what Branson says," Gideon said. "I'm telling you what I know. She found and returned a horse that was gone 11 days and dressed his hoof correctly in the field. She diagnosed early gut impaction in my stallion from 5 feet away. She's been on my property working the east fence for 9 days, and she doesn't have livestock. She doesn't have infected equipment. And the first animals in this valley showed symptoms 3 days before she arrived." Kimball held the coffee cup with both hands. "You sure about that timeline?" he said. "I'm sure about when she arrived. I'm asking you to confirm when your animals first showed trouble." Kimball thought. He was a slow, careful thinker, which was a quality Gideon had always respected in him. "First one was 11 days ago," Kimball said finally. "Maybe 12. I remember it was before the big wind." "The big wind was 10 days ago," Gideon said. Kimball looked at him. "Bring her," he said. They were at Kimball's barn by 6 the next morning, before the mist had burned off the low fields. Martha wore her work boots and her heaviest coat, and carried a cloth bag she'd packed the night before with items Gideon hadn't asked about, and now recognized as various medicinals: dried herbs, a tin of ointment, a small bottle of something clear he couldn't identify. She went to the first mare slowly, the way she'd approached Ranger. No hurry. She let the animal know she was there long before she touched her. Then she examined her. Methodically, thoroughly, talking to Kimball the whole time in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice that kept the sick animal calm. She looked at the gum line. She checked the hooves. She pressed her ear to the flank and listened, and then she stood up and looked at the second horse and did the same thing. And by the time she was finished with both of them, Kimball was watching her with the expression of a man who had revised a significant opinion. "Vesicular stomatitis," she said. "That's what it is." Kimball and Gideon looked at her. "Gideon, it's a viral disease," she said. "Spreads by insects, biting midges, black flies, that kind of thing. Not by dogs. Not by people. Not by contact with a stranger who wandered onto a neighboring property." She looked at Kimball steadily. "It comes in on livestock that's been moved through infected areas. The sores on the mouth and hooves are the signature. It looks terrible, and it frightens people, but most healthy adult horses recover if you manage the symptoms and keep them separated from the others." "How do you know this?" Kimball asked. "I grew up near the Wyoming-Colorado border," she said. "We had an outbreak when I was 14. Lost 2 horses before a vet came out and told us what we were dealing with and what to do. After that, I learned everything I could about it." She looked at the nearest mare. "You don't forget something like that when you're 14 and watching an animal suffer for a week before anyone knew how to help." Kimball was quiet. "It spreads by insects," he said slowly, like he was working through the implications. "So it doesn't matter where a person came from." "It matters where the livestock came from," Martha said. "Specifically, livestock that was recently moved from an area with an active outbreak. Did anyone in the valley bring in new horses or cattle in the last 3 to 4 weeks?" Kimball and Gideon looked at each other. "Branson brought in 8 new horses from a sale in Prenner County 6 weeks ago," Kimball said. The name hit the air, and nobody said anything for a moment. "6 weeks," Martha said. "That's consistent. The incubation period is 2 to 8 weeks before symptoms appear. His animals would have been asymptomatic for the first several weeks, and the insects would have started spreading it to neighboring properties before anyone knew there was anything to spread." Gideon leaned against the stall door. He was thinking about Cord Tillis riding his fence line. He was thinking about the county health office call. He was thinking about the careful, patient way that Wade Branson operated. "He knew," Gideon said quietly. "Not a question." "He may have known," Martha said, "or he may have gotten bad information from the sale and not been told the source herd had an outbreak." She looked at him. "But either way, he was the first one to start pointing fingers in a different direction, and the direction he pointed was at me." She said it without heat. That was the thing that got to Gideon. She said it like someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that the world would always look for someone disposable to blame, and that she was usually the most available candidate. "We need documentation," Gideon said. "Yes," she said. "Every ranch that's affected, dates of first symptoms, And we need to know where Branson's horses came from. The name of the seller in Prenter County, the date of purchase, whether there were any reports of vesicular stomatitis in that area in the weeks before the sale. That's going to require someone in Prenter County, Gideon said. Do you know anyone? He thought for a moment. I know a man in the county veterinary office there. We dealt with a water rights dispute 8 years ago. His name is Fletcher. He was straight with me then. Write to him today, Martha said. Kimball cleared his throat. What do I do in the meantime about my horses? Martha looked at the 2 mares. Keep them separated from your healthy stock. No sharing water or feed buckets. The sores, clean them twice a day with diluted salt water. Keep the flies off as best you can with whatever screening you have. Soft feed, nothing hard they have to chew against those sores. She paused. The good news is that your animals are healthy otherwise. Their eyes are clear, their body temperature is elevated, but not critically so. If you manage this correctly, you should have them recovered in 2 to 3 weeks. Kimball looked at her for a long moment. Are you a veterinarian? He said. No, she said flatly. You sound like one. I sound like someone who learned things out of necessity, she said. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. Then he looked at Gideon. What are you going to do about Branson? He said. Document everything first, Gideon said. Then we'll see. They rode back to Blackstone in silence for the first stretch, the road soft and gray in the early morning. Then Martha said, without preamble, He's going to move faster now. Why? Because he called the county health office. That means officials are coming. He expected those officials to arrive, see sick animals, find me here, hear his version of events, and act accordingly. We've just started looking in a different direction. She shifted her weight in the saddle. Gideon had lent her the bay mare, who was broad-backed and patient, and did not seem to object to Martha's size. And Martha rode with the practical competence of someone who had spent years on horseback without ever being elegant about it. He'll push harder when he realizes the story isn't going the way he planned. How much time do you think we have before the inspectors come? Gideon asked. 2 days. Maybe 3. She looked ahead at the road. The letter to Fletcher won't get there in time. I know. Is there someone who could ride to Prenter County? Get the information directly? Gideon thought. My neighbor to the north, Aldridge. He has a fast horse and a son who likes riding. Ask him today. Aldridge lost a horse this morning, Gideon said. He might not be in a cooperative frame of mind. Then explain to him that if he cooperates, he'll understand exactly who is responsible for that horse, Martha said. That might help. It did help, as it turned out. Gideon rode to Aldridge's that afternoon and found a man in a cold fury that had nowhere to go. And when Gideon laid out what Martha had found and what they needed from Prenter County, Aldridge's son, Carl, volunteered before his father had finished hearing the end of the sentence. Carl Aldridge was 19, on a horse named Bucket, who was inexplicably fast for his unremarkable appearance, and he was on the road to Prenter County before supper. Meanwhile, Gideon rode to 3 more affected ranches. He brought a notebook this time and wrote down every date, every symptom, every detail the ranchers could remember. Some of them were cooperative. A few were wary in ways that told him Branson had already talked to them. One man, a red-faced rancher named Gruber, told him flatly that as far as he was concerned, Blackstone Ranch was at the center of this until proven otherwise, and that the woman Gideon had hired ought to answer some questions to the county directly. Gideon wrote down Gruber's information anyway and thanked him and left. He got home after dark to find Martha at the kitchen table with Owen asleep in the next room and a piece of paper covered in her handwriting in the lamplight. What's this? He asked. Timeline, she said. Every ranch you visited, in order of first symptom. I've been organizing what you brought back. She moved the paper so he could see it. Look at the pattern. He looked. The outbreaks ran in an irregular ring, not a straight line out from any single point. A ring. That's a dispersal pattern, Martha said, the kind you get from insect transmission over a wide area. If one person or one animal had introduced this disease from a specific direction, you'd see a line, or at least a cluster around the original source. She tapped the paper. This is what it looks like when the disease has been in the valley for weeks already, spreading slowly on the wind and on the insects, before anyone started showing obvious symptoms. Gideon studied the map. Branson's property is inside the ring, he said. Yes, she said. His new horses would have been the first animals exposed. Yes. and the outbreaks closest to his fence line, Parrish, Kimball, those were the first to show symptoms. Yes. She folded her hands on the table. Which is what you'd expect. If the source was on Branson's property, his closest neighbors would be first affected. Can we prove that? We can show it, she said. Whether a county inspector chooses to see it is a different question. Gideon sat down across from her. They hadn't sat across a table from each other before. It felt different than standing in a barn or working a fence line. More like two people who were working on the same problem, which was exactly what it was. But somehow it felt like something more than that too, and Gideon wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. Why are you doing this? He said. She looked up from the paper. Because it's the truth, she said. And because your horses are at risk, and because… She stopped. Because? He said. She looked back down at the paper. Because if I let someone build a lie about me and don't fight it, it follows me to the next place. And the place after that. Her voice didn't waver, but there was something tired underneath it. Not the tiredness of tonight, but the tiredness of years. I'm 42 years old, Gideon. I've been the easiest person to blame in every room I've been in since I was about 20. I am done traveling light on everyone else's convenience. He didn't say anything for a moment. Your husband, he said carefully. Where is he? Dead, she said. 6 years ago. Fever. Very fast. She said it the way you said things you'd made your peace with but not your comfort with. Owen was 5. I'm sorry, he said. I know, she said, and he believed she believed him. They sat for a moment with that between them, the lamp burning low, the sound of Judge shifting in his sleep in the other room. I have to ask you something, Gideon said. Go ahead. When you came up that road with Ranger, you'd been traveling, your wagon was broken, you had 73 cents, she said. Right. He looked at the table. There are other ranches in this valley, other places that might have offered work. She was quiet. Why'd you stop here? He asked. She thought about this for longer than he expected. Your gate was shut, she said finally. Every other spread in this valley has an open gate, or a gate that opens on a track because people come and go all the time. She looked at him. Yours was shut, and there was something about that. She stopped again, and then seemed to decide to say the thing plainly. A gate that stays shut for a long time is usually being kept closed by something that hurts. And I have found, in my experience, that people who are keeping something that hurts behind a shut gate are usually people who understand that other people do the same. The lamp made a small sound. The wick needed trimming. Gideon stood up and trimmed it. I'll send the letter to Fletcher in Prenner County first thing tomorrow, he said. Even if Carl gets there first, it's good to have a second contact. Yes, she said. And we should talk to Parrish again. He was the first, and he's closer to Branson's property than Kimball. If he's willing to document his timeline clearly, that helps the pattern. Dale Parrish doesn't like me, Martha said. He doesn't know you. That's rarely stopped anyone in my experience. I'll go with you, Gideon said. Parrish is stubborn, but he's not stupid. He doesn't want his ranch destroyed by this any more than anyone else does. She looked at him with that expression again, reading whether the statement was solid before she put her weight on it. All right, she said. She stood up and gathered the papers carefully, stacking them in a particular order that Gideon suspected made complete sense in an organizational system he didn't have access to. There's something else, she said, her back to him, putting the papers into the cloth bag she'd used at Kimball's. What? She turned around. Owen told me today that 2 of the boys from town threw a rock at Judge. Gideon went still. When? When he walked to the creek this afternoon. 2 boys, maybe 12, 13. They didn't come onto your property. They were on the road. But they threw a rock and called Judge a disease dog. She kept her voice flat, but her jaw was tight. Owen's all right. Judge is all right. It was just a rock. Just a rock, Gideon repeated. This is what I mean about it moving fast, she said quietly. When children are throwing rocks at dogs, it means the story has already spread to the part of the community where nobody's actually thinking anymore. They're just reacting. She shouldered the bag. We need the evidence before that goes any further. I'll talk to… You can't talk your way out of this, she said. Not unkindly. Not with words and not with your reputation. Only the facts will do it, and only if we get them in front of someone official before Branson does. She went to the door. Martha, he said. She stopped. Owen's a good boy, Gideon said. It came out smaller than he meant it. What he meant was something larger, that he saw what she'd built in that boy in 6 hard years alone, that he recognized the quality of what was walking around inside that quiet child who only spoke to people he trusted. But those words didn't quite form up, so he said the smaller thing. She was still for a moment. He is, she said. Her voice had gone soft at the edges in a way he hadn't heard before. He's the best thing I've ever done. She went out. The next morning, Branson himself appeared. Not Tillis. Branson. He came mid-morning, in his good coat with a silver pin on the lapel, riding a horse that cost more than most of the ranches in the valley were worth. He came with 2 men Gideon didn't know, and he came in through the open gate with the comfortable arrogance of someone who expected every door to open for him. Gideon was at the paddock fence and saw him coming and stayed where he was. Branson pulled up about 10 feet away and looked down from the horse. Gideon, he said, warm as a man who owned the warmth. I've been worried about you. Is that right, Gideon said. The situation in the valley. This disease business. I want you to know I'm doing everything I can to coordinate a response. County inspectors will be here day after tomorrow. I've made sure they have a complete picture. Whose picture? Gideon said. Branson smiled. The smile went nowhere near his eyes. I've simply been talking to the affected ranchers, gathering information. He glanced toward the line shack, from which smoke was rising in the clear morning air. I hear the woman you hired has been doing the same thing, riding to the neighboring ranches, asking questions. She has relevant knowledge, Gideon said. She's been helpful. I'm sure she has. Branson turned his horse slightly, a leisurely movement that was also a way of looking at the property, the barn, the paddock, the shack. Gideon, I'm going to say this as a neighbor and someone who has always respected you. The county inspectors are going to have questions about your new hire, about where she came from, about the animals she's been in contact with. I would hate for your ranch to bear the consequences of someone else's poor choices. Gideon looked at him. Wade, he said. When did you bring in those 8 horses from the Prenner County sale? Branson's horse took a small step sideways. Branson corrected it. I bring in horses regularly, Branson said. I can't keep track of every 6 weeks ago, Gideon said. Prenner County sale. 8 horses. I'm asking whether you knew about any disease reports in the Prenner County area at the time of purchase. The smile remained. Below it, something shifted. I'd be careful about making accusations, Branson said quietly. You're one man with a broken-down gate and a hired hand with a stray dog. I'm the person who's been here, building this valley, for 30 years. You think about which one of those stories the county is going to believe. I'm not making accusations, Gideon said. I asked a question. Branson looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode out. Gideon stood at the fence until the 3 riders were through the gate and down the road. Then he turned around. Martha was standing in the doorway of the shack. She had been there long enough to hear all of it. Their eyes met across the yard. She held up 2 fingers. 2 days. He nodded. He went inside and wrote the letter to Fletcher in Prenner County, and this time he wrote it like a man who had run out of careful. The inspectors came on a Thursday. There were 3 of them, county men in clean coats with leather satchels, and the official manner of people who had been told what they were going to find before they arrived. The lead inspector was a man named Doyle, with a neat gray beard and small, careful eyes that moved around Blackstone Ranch the way Tillis's had moved, but with the additional weight of authority behind them. Branson rode in with them. He hadn't been invited. He came anyway. Doyle went through the formal introduction and said they were there to assess the disease situation in the valley and to determine origin and containment measures. He was polite. I was also already looking at the line shack when he said it. Who else is on this property? He asked Gideon. A hired hand and her son, Gideon said. She's been working the east fence line. We'll need to speak with her, Doyle said. Of course, Gideon said. She'll want to speak with you too. Doyle blinked. That wasn't the answer he'd been expecting. Martha came across the yard at a walk, Judge at her heel, Owen hanging back near the shack door where Gideon had asked him to stay. She wore her work clothes and her expression, which was the one she'd worn when Tillis showed up, perfectly, deliberately still. She stopped about 6 feet from Doyle and looked at him. Martha Calloway, she said, I understand you're here about vesicular stomatitis. Doyle's careful eyes sharpened. You know the disease? He said. I've seen an outbreak, she said. Wyoming, 1871. I can describe the full symptom progression, the transmission mechanism, the incubation period, and the management protocol if that would be useful. But I thought you might first want to see this. She reached into the cloth bag and brought out the papers. Not the originals. Gideon had made copies of the originals the night before, in his own hand, which she had corrected and annotated in hers. The originals were in a locked tin box under the floorboard of the shack, a precaution she'd suggested. She handed the papers to Doyle. He looked at them. He kept looking at them. The two men behind him looked over his shoulder. Branson, on his horse at the edge of the group, leaned forward slightly. "What is that?" Branson said. Doyle didn't answer him. "These dates," Doyle said to Martha. "You compiled these yourself?" "With Mr. Mercer," she said. "From direct conversations with 11 affected ranchers. The dates of first symptom, the location of each ranch, the symptom progression." She pointed at the paper. "The dispersal pattern is consistent with insect transmission from a central source that had been active for several weeks before any rancher noticed visible symptoms. If you plot the affected ranches on a map, the pattern centers on the property 3 miles south of here." Doyle looked up at her. Wade Branson's horse moved under him, and for once, it wasn't a leisurely, controlled movement. "Now hold on," Branson said. "This woman has been running around the valley for 2 days talking to people, stirring things up." "Mr. Branson," Doyle's voice was quiet and flat. "When did you bring in horses from Prenner County?" Silence. A meadowlark called somewhere in the east pasture. "6 weeks ago," Branson said. "But I don't see what that has to do with— Were there any disease reports in the Prenner County area at the time of that sale?" There were rumors, but nothing official." "Rumors," Doyle said. "You can't take the word of some—" Branson stopped himself. Everyone heard what word he'd started to say. Doyle looked at him for a moment, then he looked back at Martha's papers. "I'll need to visit your property, Mr. Branson," he said. "Today." Martha stood with her hands at her sides, and her face gave nothing away. But Gideon was standing 2 feet to her left, and he saw her exhale. One small, controlled breath. The kind you let out when something you've been holding a long time finally starts to move in the right direction. Doyle left Blackstone Ranch with Martha's papers folded carefully into his leather satchel, and Wade Branson rode south without saying another word to anyone. That should have felt like a victory. It didn't, quite. Gideon knew men like Doyle. Careful men, institutional men, men who moved in the direction that caused them the least professional trouble. Doyle had listened. Doyle had asked the right questions. But listening and asking questions was not the same as acting on what you'd heard. And the county health office was not an organization that had ever been known for moving quickly against someone with Branson standing in the valley. Martha knew it too. She came in from the shack that evening while Gideon was sitting on the main house porch, and she stood in the yard rather than coming up the steps, which was still her habit, keeping a certain distance, not assuming invitation. "What's your read on Doyle?" she asked. "Honest enough," Gideon said. "Not brave." She nodded, like that confirmed something. "He'll go to Branson's property," she said. "He'll look at the horses, and then he'll write a report that says the evidence is inconclusive and that further investigation is needed, and that in the meantime all ranchers in the valley should observe quarantine protocols." She put her hands in her coat pockets. "That's the middle path. That's what careful men do." "And the accusations against you?" "He won't pursue them if the evidence doesn't support them," she said. "But he won't clear me publicly either. He'll just quietly set them aside and Branson will find another angle." She looked out past the fence line. "There's something I need to ask you." "Go ahead." "Carl Aldridge. He went to Prenner County 2 days ago. Have you heard from him?" "Not yet," Gideon said. "It's a 2-day ride each way on a fast horse." "I know. But what I need from Prenner County isn't just confirmation that there was an outbreak." She turned to look at him directly. "I need the name of the seller, the specific man who sold Branson those 8 horses. And I need to know whether that man knew about the disease in his herd before the sale. If he knew and sold them anyway, then we have something more than a pattern," she said. "We have a transaction, a specific act on a specific date between specific people. That's not something Doyle can call inconclusive." Gideon leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What if Carl can't get that from Fletcher?" "Then I need to go there myself," she said. He looked at her. That's 4 days round trip, he said. The county inspector could make a ruling before you're back. I know. And leaving now, when Branson's likely going to push harder. I know that too, she said, which is why I'm not going unless there's no other way. She met his eyes. But I want you to know that I'm willing to. In case you were wondering how serious I am about this. He held her gaze for a moment. I wasn't wondering, he said. She nodded once and went back to the shack. Gideon sat on the porch another hour after that, in the particular quiet of a ranch at night when the animals have settled and the wind has laid down and there's nothing between you and whatever you're carrying except the dark. He thought about the gate at the end of the drive, the one he'd kept shut for 6 years. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about the way Martha had said the best thing I've ever done when she talked about Owen, and the way her voice had gone soft at the edges, and how that softness had the same quality as something solid under a thin layer of give, strong underneath, not weak. He went to bed and slept badly and was up before dawn. Carl Aldridge came back the following afternoon. He arrived in a cloud of road dust on the inexplicably fast bucket, looking like a young man who had ridden very hard and was proud of it in the specific way of 19-year-olds who had just done the first genuinely consequential thing of their lives. He brought a letter from Fletcher. Gideon read it at the kitchen table with Martha across from him and Owen on the floor with Judge, pretending to be occupied with something else and listening to every word. Fletcher confirmed an outbreak of vesicular stomatitis in Prenter County beginning approximately 8 weeks prior to the letter's date. He confirmed that the county veterinary office had issued informal advisories to local livestock sellers approximately 6 weeks ago. Informal, not official, which was an important distinction, advising them to disclose any potential exposure before sale. He confirmed that a seller named Elias Gaunt had sold 12 horses from his affected property during that period, 8 of which had been purchased by a buyer from Harlan County, matching the description Carl had provided. He also confirmed that Gant had been present at the county veterinary office meeting where the advisories were discussed. Gideon set the letter down. Gant was at the meeting, he said. Yes, Martha said. She was very still. He knew about the advisories. He knew. And he sold 12 horses anyway, 8 to Branson. Yes, she pressed her fingers flat on the table. Which means Branson may not have known. He may have bought those horses in good faith. Or he may have known and bought them anyway because the price was good, and he thought he could manage it quietly. She looked at Gideon. Either way, the origin isn't a mystery dog. The origin is a transaction in Prenter County between a dishonest seller and a buyer who either didn't know or chose not to know. Can Fletcher testify to this? Gideon asked. He's a county official. His letter is documentation, not testimony, but it's enough to take to Doyle. We need to go today, Gideon said. Yes. He was reaching for his coat when the knock came at the door. Not a polite knock. 3 solid impacts, the kind that meant official business or anger, and sometimes both. Gideon opened the door. It was Doyle. And behind him 2 men Gideon hadn't seen before, not county men by the look of them. One was heavy-set, with a badge on his coat that indicated some kind of livestock regulatory authority. The other was younger and had a notebook. Mr. Mercer, Doyle said. He looked unhappy. I need to speak with you and the woman. Come in, Gideon said. They came in. The kitchen felt very small with 5 adults in it. Owen picked up Judge and took him to the far corner without being told, which was good thinking. Doyle looked at Martha. Mrs. Calloway, he said, I visited Branson's property yesterday. I know, she said. He looked slightly thrown by that. How do you... Bill Kimball rode past Branson's south fence yesterday afternoon and saw your buggy there, she said. He stopped by here on his way home. Doyle's jaw tightened slightly. I was a man who preferred to control the information in a room, and this room was not cooperating. The horses on Branson's property show clear signs of vesicular stomatitis, he said. Several animals. The disease appears to have been present for several weeks. Yes, Martha said. That's consistent with what I documented. That documentation, the heavy-set man said. He had not introduced himself. You compiled it how? By writing to 11 ranches over 3 days and asking direct questions, Martha said, then organizing the responses by date and location. You're not a veterinarian, the man said. No, she said. I'm a woman who knows livestock disease. The observations are accurate. You can verify every one of them by going to the ranchers directly. We've already spoken to several, the man said, including Mr. Gruber, who expressed concerns about the reliability of information gathered by an outside party with an interest in the outcome. I have an interest in the truth, Martha said. Mr. Gruber has an interest in having someone to blame for his sick horses that isn't the man who sold him water access rights last spring. She said it quietly, without aggression, just stating a thing she'd observed. Those are different kinds of interests. The heavy-set man looked at her with the expression of someone who had been expecting a different kind of opponent. Doyle cleared his throat. The reason we're here is that Mr. Branson has submitted a formal complaint against you, Mrs. Calloway, and against this property. On what grounds? Gideon said. Unauthorized movement of potentially infected animals. One dog, Gideon said, and there is no evidence that dog has any connection to this disease. An obstruction of a county health investigation, Doyle continued. He's alleging that your documentation effort was an attempt to mislead county officials and redirect blame. The younger man was writing in his notebook. His pen made a small scratching sound in the quiet. Martha hadn't moved. She was sitting with her hands on the table, flat and still, and Gideon recognized the posture now. It was the posture of someone who had decided, before the conversation started, exactly how far they were going to let themselves be moved. Mr. Doyle, she said, we have a letter. She picked up Fletcher's letter and held it out across the table. Doyle took it. He read it. He read it again. The heavy-set man leaned over and read it over Doyle's shoulder. His expression shifted. This is from the Prenter County Veterinary Office, Doyle said. Yes. This says the seller, Elias Gant, was present at a meeting where informal disease advisories were issued prior to his sale of affected horses. Yes. And 8 of those horses were sold to Wade Branson, Martha said, 6 weeks ago. The room was very quiet. If Branson knew he was buying potentially exposed animals, Gideon said, and brought them into this valley without disclosure, and then called your office with a complaint that redirected attention away from that fact. I understand the implication, Mr. Mercer, Doyle said. He sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. The complaint Branson filed, Martha said. When did he file it? Doyle hesitated. Yesterday, he said, after we visited his property. After you visited his property and saw the sick horses, Martha said. And after it became clear that the timeline didn't support the story he'd been telling. She looked at him steadily. He filed a complaint against me within hours of you finding evidence that pointed at him. You understand what that means. Doyle folded Fletcher's letter carefully along its existing creases. I need to take this back to the office, he said. Of course, Martha said. There's a copy. The heavy-set man looked up sharply. A copy? I made 2, she said. I thought that was prudent. She had, in fact, made 3. The third was in the locked tin box under the floorboard, and the second had gone to Carl Aldridge to hold at his father's place. Gideon hadn't known about the third copy until this moment. He looked at her sideways. She didn't look back at him. Doyle stood. The other 2 men followed. At the door, Doyle paused. Mrs. Calloway, he said, the formal complaint is still on file. I can't simply set it aside because of this letter. There will need to be a formal review. When? Gideon said. Within the week. We'll send notice. Doyle looked at Martha once more, with the expression of a man reassessing something he'd thought was simple. In the meantime, don't leave the valley. He left. The younger man closed his notebook. He was the last one out, and as he passed through the door, he glanced back at Martha with a look that was not quite what Gideon expected from a county official's assistant. It was closer to the look you gave someone when you'd just watched them hold a difficult line. Then the door closed. Owen's voice came from the corner immediately. Are we in trouble? No, Gideon said. Are you sure? No, Martha said, but we're in less trouble than we were an hour ago. Owen appeared to find this acceptable. Judge wiggled out of his arms and trotted to the door to sniff along the threshold where the strangers had stood. Gideon looked at Martha. 3 copies, he said. My father always said that important papers have a way of going missing when someone else needs them to, she said. She stood up and gathered the remaining documents. We need to talk to Parrish. Today? Today. Dale Parrish's spread was the closest ranch to Branson's south fence. His 3 sick mares were at the front of Martha's documentation, and his testimony about the timeline was the sharpest piece of the pattern. But he'd been cold to Gideon at the fence line, and he'd been colder since Branson had talked to him. They rode over together. Martha was on the bay mare again, moving at a pace that said she was conserving her knees for the conversation rather than the ride. Gideon had noticed she always did that. She calculated where her body would be needed most and managed the approach accordingly. She never mentioned her knees, she just moved around them. Parrish was in his yard when they came up the road. He saw them coming and didn't go inside, which Gideon decided to take as a good sign. "Dale," Gideon said. "Gideon." Parrish looked at Martha without warmth. "Mrs. Calloway." "Thank you for not making us knock," Martha said. Parrish blinked. That was apparently not what he'd expected her to open with. "We have new information," Gideon said, and he told him about Fletcher's letter. Not the whole thing, the key parts. Gant's presence at the advisory meeting, the sale date, the 8 horses. Parrish listened. His expression moved through skepticism to calculation to something quieter and less comfortable. He knew, Parrish said, not about Branson, about Gant, but the same word covered both. Gant almost certainly knew, Gideon said. Whether Branson knew at the time of purchase, we can't say for certain. But Branson knew by the time he called the health office, Martha said. His horses were already showing symptoms. He knew where they came from. And instead of reporting that, he reported me. Parrish looked at her for a long moment. "You lost a mare," Martha said. "She was your best breeding animal. I'm sorry for that. I know what that costs, and I know it can't be made right by a letter from Prenter County." She paused. "But the thing that killed her started in Prenter County. Not in Wyoming, not on a widow's wagon, not from a one-eared dog. And if you want the person responsible for that loss to answer for it, then your testimony about when your animals first showed symptoms is the piece that makes the pattern undeniable." Parrish's jaw worked. "I told Branson I'd support his complaint," he said. "I know," Martha said. "I said that before I knew about the letter." "I know that too." Parrish looked past them, out at his east pasture where his remaining horses were moving in the afternoon light. "My mares," he said. "The 3 that are sick. They gonna make it?" Martha looked at him directly. "If you follow the management protocol I described to Kimball, separate feed and water, clean the sores twice daily, soft feed, keep them moving, 2 of them have a very good chance." She paused. "The roan with the fever that spiked day before yesterday. I'm less certain about her. She was hit harder than the others, and she's older." Parrish's face did something complicated. "She was Eleanor's favorite," Gideon said quietly. He hadn't known that until this moment. He'd just remembered that Eleanor had admired Parrish's roan mare once, at a gathering before she got sick, had said she moved like water over rock. Parrish looked at him sharply. "You remember that," Parrish said. "Eleanor remembered it," Gideon said. "I just kept it." Something gave way in Parrish's face. Not dramatically, just a small private surrender, the kind that older men made when grief and stubbornness had been holding each other in balance for too long, and one of them finally won. "What do you need from me?" he said. "A written statement," Martha said. "Exactly what you told me that first evening. When your animals first showed symptoms, what the symptoms were, and the sequence. Date and sign it. And then? And then let us worry about what happens with it," Gideon said. Parrish went inside and came back with paper and a pen and sat down on his porch steps and wrote it out slowly and carefully, the way a man wrote something he was putting his name to and intended to stand behind. When he handed it to Martha, he looked at her directly for the first time. "I didn't treat you fairly," he said. Not an apology exactly. More like a statement of fact he'd decided deserved to be spoken plainly. Martha took the paper. "No," she said. "You didn't." She didn't add anything to it. Didn't soften it for him. Just let it stand. Gideon respected that more than he could easily say. They rode back to Blackstone with Parrish's statement added to the file, and the afternoon was going golden when they came through the gate and found Owen in the yard teaching Judge to sit on command, which Judge was doing with an expression of deep personal condescension. "How's it going?" Gideon asked. "He already knew how to sit," Owen said. "He's just making me think I taught him something, so I'll feel good about it." "Sounds about right," Gideon said. He took the horses to the barn and was brushing down the bay when Martha came to the barn door. "Branson is going to try something else," she said, "before the formal review." Gideon kept brushing. "What makes you say so?" "Because the formal review is going to go against him. He's smart enough to know that, which means his best play now is to do something that makes the review irrelevant." She leaned against the doorframe. "He still has the water rights question." Gideon's hand slowed on the brush. "What do you know about that?" he said. "You mentioned it when Tillis came by that first week. Branson's been working the county assessor on the North Creek rights." She paused. "I did some asking around when I was visiting the other ranches. Apparently the assessor, Purcell, has been under pressure for some time. Branson's made life difficult for men who didn't cooperate before." "Purcell's an honest man," Gideon said. "Honest men make decisions under pressure," Martha said, "especially when the pressure comes with financial consequences." She looked at him steadily. "If Branson can get Purcell to backdate a transfer of the water rights before the formal review happens, then he changes the entire subject. The disease question stops mattering. The question becomes whether you can operate a ranch without North Creek access." Gideon set down the brush. He looked at the bay mare for a moment. "If he gets those water rights transferred," he said, "this ranch folds. Without the North Creek, I can't carry the herd through a dry summer. I'd have to sell off most of the horses." "I know," she said, "and he knows it." "Yes." He walked out of the barn into the evening air. "When?" he said. "When would he move on that?" "Soon," she said. "Before the review. Maybe before the end of the week." "I need to go see Purcell," Gideon said. "Yes." She hesitated. "I'd like to come with you." He looked at her. "Purcell's going to be nervous," she said. "Nervous men respond better when there are witnesses, and I want to see his face when we tell him about Fletcher's letter." "You think Purcell knows about the disease situation?" "I think Purcell knows everything that happens in this valley," she said. "That's what assessors do. They know who's buying and selling and who's in trouble and who's holding leverage over whom." She paused. "I think he's been waiting to see which way this goes before he decides which way he goes. And if we show him it's going against Branson, then suddenly the pressure he's been feeling might look different to him." Gideon thought about that. "You think fast," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like an observation of something he hadn't expected and now couldn't unsee. "I've had to," she said simply. They went to Purcell's office the next morning. The assessor's office was in the county seat, 11 miles west, and they made the ride early enough to arrive when the office had just opened and before the day had a chance to fill up with other people's business. Martha rode the bay mare and Gideon rode his spare gelding, and they talked very little on the way, which was a habit they'd both fallen into, comfortable with the quiet, not fighting it. Purcell was a thin man, as Gideon remembered him, with the look of someone who had been making small compromises for so long that the original shape of him was hard to find anymore. He looked up when they came in, and his eyes went from Gideon to Martha and back to Gideon with the particular anxiety of a man who knows more about a situation than he wants to be asked about. "Gideon," he said. "Morning, Harlan." Gideon pulled off his hat. "This is Martha Calloway. She's been working at Blackstone." "I've heard," Purcell said. He didn't say it warmly. "Then you've probably heard a few different versions," Martha said pleasantly. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited. Not because she was being rude, but because she'd clearly decided that standing while he sat was not the arrangement that served her purpose. "We brought some information you might not have seen yet." She put Fletcher's letter on his desk. Purcell looked at it. He didn't pick it up. "Go ahead and read it," Gideon said. Purcell read it. His face did several things. "The formal review is scheduled for later this week," Martha said, while he was reading. "Based on the documentation we've provided to Inspector Doyle, the evidence points clearly to Prenter County livestock as the origin of the valley outbreak. Not to this property, not to me." She let that sit for a moment. "I imagine that changes the calculus for anyone who's been anticipating a different outcome." Purcell set the letter down. "I don't know what you're suggesting," he said. "I'm suggesting," Martha said, "that Mr. Branson's position in this county is about to be considerably less secure than it's been, and that if there are any pending decisions, administrative decisions, say, relating to water rights, that have been influenced by that position, this might be a good moment to take a second look at them." Purcell's hands were on the desk. They weren't moving. "If any documentation has been prepared that would transfer North Creek water rights away from Blackstone Ranch." Gideon said quietly. And if that documentation hasn't been finalized yet, I'd ask you to consider very carefully what you're signing your name to. And who's applying pressure to make you sign it? Martha said. I haven't signed anything, Purcell said. The words came out faster than he intended. He heard it himself and pressed his lips together. Good, Martha said. That's good, Harlan. She said the first name the way someone said it when they wanted to remind a person that they were still a person and not just a cog in someone else's machine. Because when this review concludes, and it concludes the way it's going to conclude based on this evidence, everyone in this valley is going to be reassessing where they stand in relation to Wade Branson, and that includes how they remember who did what and when. Purcell looked at the letter again. Then he looked at Martha. You're not what I expected, he said. Nobody ever is, she said. That's usually how I stay ahead. They rode back to Blackstone in the early afternoon. The air had turned colder, the first real bite of advancing autumn in it, and the light was the thin gold light of a season that knew it was running out of time. Halfway back, Owen met them on the road. He was on foot, moving fast, Judge trotting beside him. Gideon pulled up. What's wrong? Man came to the ranch, Owen said. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, from something else. I didn't know him. He rode in and looked around, and when he saw I was there alone, he told me to give you a message. What message? Martha said. She'd brought the bay mare to a stop, and she was very still in the saddle. Owen looked at her. He said to tell the fat widow that this valley has a long memory, he said. His voice was careful and flat, the way boys went flat when they were trying very hard not to show that something had frightened them. He said whatever papers you have won't matter if you're not around to present them. Nobody spoke for a moment. Judge pressed against Owen's leg. What did he look like? Gideon said. His voice was careful too. Big, brown coat. His horse had a brand I didn't recognize. Owen paused. He smiled when he said it. That's the part that... He stopped. I know, Martha said. She swung down from the mare in her practical, inelegant way and crouched in front of her son. Her knees protested it. Gideon could see that, but she did it anyway. Look at me. Owen looked at her. Are you all right? She said. Yes, he said. You didn't let him see you were scared. I tried not to. That's all you ever have to do, she said. Just try not to. She put her hand on the side of his face for a second, the briefest gesture, and then she stood back up. She looked at Gideon over the boy's head. Her eyes were not frightened. They were something else. The look of a person who has been pushed to a particular line and has decided clearly and finally that they are not going to step back from it. The copies, she said, are Carl Aldridge's copies somewhere Branson's men can't easily get to? His father's lockbox, Gideon said. In the house. Good. She gathered the mare's reins. I need to write 2 more letters tonight, one to the county seat newspaper and one to the state livestock board. Martha. He just sent a man to threaten my son, she said. We are done being patient. She walked back toward Blackstone, leading the mare, Owen beside her, Judge at the boy's heel. Gideon watched them for a moment. Then he turned his horse toward the Aldridge place at a canter, because he had 3 things he needed to do before dark, and patience had just run out on him too. Carl Aldridge was cleaning a rifle on his father's porch when Gideon rode up, and he set it down before Gideon had even dismounted, reading something in the way the older man was riding that said this wasn't a social call. What happened? Carl said. Gideon told him about the man in the brown coat, about the message he'd left with Owen. He watched Carl's face go through several things in quick succession, surprise, then anger, then the particular hardening of a young man who has just discovered that the thing he rode 2 days to Prenter County and back to help with has become something with sharper edges than he realized. The copies you're holding, Gideon said. Can your father put them somewhere more secure than the lockbox? There's a strong box at the county clerk's office in town, Carl said. My father has a deposit arrangement there. He's been using it since the Horace Tilden business 3 years back. He paused. You want me to take them in today? This afternoon, Gideon said. And Carl, don't talk about it. Not to anyone who doesn't need to know. Carl nodded. He was young, but he wasn't foolish, and he had the quality that Gideon valued in a man regardless of age. He understood when a situation had gotten serious without needing it, explained to him 3 times. Is Mrs. Calloway all right? Carl asked. Gideon stopped. Why? Carl picked up the rifle again, more for something to do with his hands than any need to clean it further. I talked to her when I got back from Prenner County. Before I came to you, she came out to the gate when she heard Bucket coming, and she asked me about Fletcher before I'd even tied the horse. Smart questions. Specific. He paused. She asked me if Gant had any other buyers in the region she should know about, like she was already thinking about who else might be affected. What did you tell her? Fletcher mentioned one other buyer, a ranch near the state line. I don't know if it matters. He looked at Gideon. She's the kind of person who should have been doing something important a long time ago. Gideon held that statement for a moment. Get those papers to the county clerk today, he said. Then he rode home. The letters Martha wrote that night were not long. She didn't have a gift for long when short was what was needed. She wrote to the county seat newspaper, a weekly called the Harlan Courier, and she wrote out the core facts without editorial flourish: dates, locations, the Prenner County sale, Fletcher's letter, the dispersal pattern, the formal complaint filed by Branson within hours of the inspection. She put no interpretation on any of it. She let the sequence speak. The letter to the State Livestock Board was more formal and went into greater technical detail about the disease identification and transmission, referencing her observations at Kimball's and Parrish's properties, and formally requesting that a state-level investigator review the matter given the documented conflict of interest in how the county complaint had been filed. She finished both letters after midnight. Gideon knew because he hadn't slept either, and he'd seen the light in the shack window from the main house. He didn't go over. He sat by his own window and watched the light and thought about a woman sitting at a small table in a cold shack writing letters that might protect this valley. And he thought about the fact that 2 months ago that shack had been empty and the ranch had been slowly going to seed and the gate at the end of the drive had been shut, and he didn't quite know what to do with the difference between then and now, except that it felt like something he hadn't expected to feel again. He made himself go to bed. The formal review was scheduled for Friday morning at the county office in town. It was Wednesday now. On Thursday, 2 things happened. The first was that Dale Parrish rode to Blackstone in the early morning, and he came through the open gate and tied his horse and came to the main house door and knocked, which he hadn't done in 6 years. Gideon opened the door and Parrish stood there with his hat in his hands. "My roan mare," Parrish said. "She turned around last night. Fever broke. She's eating." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Martha said to keep her moving," Parrish said. "I walked her 3 times yesterday. Felt like a fool, walking a horse in circles in the dark." He looked at the ground. "She's eating this morning." "Come in," Gideon said. "I won't. I just wanted—" Parrish stopped. He looked past Gideon toward the line shack, where smoke was already rising from the chimney. "I want to talk to her." "I'll get her," Gideon said. Martha came across the yard with her coat not fully buttoned, having clearly been pulled away from breakfast, and she stopped when she saw Parrish. She didn't say anything. She waited. "The roan's eating," Parrish said. Martha's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a small loosening around the eyes. "That's good news," she said. "I know I wasn't—" He stopped again. Parrish was not a man who had a lot of practice with the particular sentence he was trying to say. "I listened to Branson when I shouldn't have. And I knew better. Some part of me knew better. But when you're scared and your animals are dying, you want it to be something, someone, you can point at." Martha looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. Not forgiving him exactly, just acknowledging that she understood how the machinery worked. She'd been inside that machinery too many times not to. "I'll be at the review tomorrow," Parrish said. "If that helps." "It helps," she said. Parrish put his hat back on, nodded at Gideon, and went to his horse. When he was gone, Martha looked at Gideon. "That's 3 ranchers who'll speak at the review," she said. "Kimball, Aldridge Sr., and now Parrish." "Gruber won't come," Gideon said. "No, but we don't need Gruber." She buttoned the rest of her coat. "What we need is for Doyle to understand that the community's position has shifted and that whatever Branson told him represents one end of the valley's opinion, not the center of it." The second thing that happened on Thursday was worse. Gideon was in the barn in the afternoon checking Ranger's hoof, the one Martha had wrapped in the field, now properly shod and healing well, when he heard horses coming up the road fast. Not 1 horse. 3. He came out of the barn. It was Tillis and 2 men Gideon had seen before, the same 2 who'd ridden in with Branson the week before. They came through the gate without stopping and pulled up in the yard with the particular deliberateness of men who had been told to make an impression. "Mercer," Tillis said. I was sitting his horse with an ease that was meant to look like indifference, but was actually very carefully arranged. "Mr. Branson asked me to let you know he's withdrawing the formal complaint." Gideon looked at him. "Is that right?" he said. He thought about it and decided the whole matter got out of hand. "No need for a formal review. He's willing to let it go if you are." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He's withdrawing the complaint against Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Against this property and everyone on it," Tillis said. "Clean slate. And in exchange?" "No exchange. Just goodwill." Tillis smiled. "Neighbor to neighbor." "The water rights," Gideon said. The smile stayed. "What water rights?" Tillis said. "The transfer Purcell was preparing. Is that off the table too, or just the complaint?" Tillis looked at him without the smile now. "I don't know anything about any transfer," he said. "You're a bad liar, Cord," Gideon said pleasantly. "You always have been. You get a kind of careful around the eyes." One of the other men shifted in his saddle. "Mr. Branson is offering a settlement," Tillis said, dropping the pleasantries. "He drops the complaint, you drop the documentation. Both sides step back. Nobody takes this to a formal review, and nobody writes any letters to any newspapers." "He knows about the letters," Gideon said. "He knows about a lot of things." "Does he know that the copies of Fletcher's letter are in the county clerk's strongbox?" Tillis's careful eyes got more careful. "We go to the review tomorrow," Gideon said. "Tell him that." "Mercer?" "Tell him," Gideon said, and went back into the barn. He stood in the barn until he heard the 3 horses leave. Then he put his hand on Ranger's neck and stayed there for a moment, breathing through it. Martha appeared in the barn door. "I heard," she said. "He's scared," Gideon said. "That's actually a good sign." "Scared men do stupid things," she said. "He already did the stupid thing. He sent someone to threaten Owen." Gideon turned around. "Everything after that is just consequence catching up." She looked at him for a moment. "Are you certain about tomorrow?" she said. "I need you to be certain, not brave. Certain." He thought about that distinction. "Yes," he said. "I'm certain." She nodded once. Then, "Ranger's hoof looks good." "It does. You did good work on it, out in the field." "I had leather and cord and a horse that needed help," she said. "You work with what you have." She went back out. He stood there a moment longer, thinking about that sentence. You work with what you have, and how it seemed to be the principle Martha Calloway organized her entire life around, and how that was both the saddest and the most solid thing he'd heard in a long time. Friday morning came in cold and clear, with a hard frost on the ground that crunched underfoot and put white across the tops of the fence posts. Martha was up before dawn. Gideon heard her moving in the shack and saw the lamplight and didn't go over. He made coffee in the main house and left a cup on the porch step for her, which she found and took without comment. And that was the extent of the conversation before they rode into town. Owen stayed at Aldridge's. He'd argued about this until Martha gave him a look that ended the argument, and then he'd packed a small bag and gone with Carl without further complaint, Judge trotting at his heel with the air of a bodyguard who had accepted the assignment under protest. The county office was a solid 2-story building at the center of town, with a meeting room on the ground floor that smelled of old paper and lamp oil and too many serious conversations. By the time Gideon and Martha arrived, Kimball was already there, and Aldridge Sr. and Parrish, and 2 other ranchers Gideon recognized from the valley's north end, who he hadn't expected, a man named Sorensen and his brother-in-law Vic, who raised cattle in the high pastures and had lost 4 animals to the disease in the past week. Doyle was at the head of the table. The heavy-set man from the first visit was there too, introduced properly this time as Hargreaves, a state livestock regulatory official who had apparently traveled overnight from the capital after receiving Martha's letter. That was the first surprise. The second was that Purcell was there, sitting in the far corner of the room with his hat on his knee and the look of a man who had made a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with but had made it anyway. Branson was not there. Doyle called the room to order at 9 o'clock. The first hour was formal and procedural and involved a great deal of documentation being passed around the table and read in silence. Martha sat to Gideon's left and said almost nothing during this period. She had brought her complete file, every page, every date, the maps she'd drawn of the dispersal pattern, and she placed it in front of Hargreaves without being asked. which caused Doyle to look at her and then at Hargreaves in a way that suggested he was recalibrating the hierarchy of this meeting. Hargreaves read everything. He read slowly and thoroughly and didn't perform either reaction or neutrality. He just read. Then he looked up and said, "Mrs. Calloway, walk me through the dispersal map." She did. She stood up, which was harder for her than it looked. Her knees always worse after sitting, and she laid the map on the table and walked Hargreaves through it the way she'd walked Gideon through it at the kitchen table, pointing at each affected ranch, naming the date of first symptom, tracing the arc of the pattern. The room was very quiet. When she finished, Hargreaves said, "And your identification of the disease as vesicular stomatitis, you made that determination on what basis?" "Direct examination of affected animals at Kimball's ranch," she said. "Oral sores consistent with VS presentation, hoof lesions on one animal, fever pattern and appetite loss in line with documented VS progression. I also referenced my direct experience with a VS outbreak in Wyoming in 1871. "You're not a veterinarian," Hargreaves said. "No, sir, but the symptoms are not ambiguous once you've seen them, and my observations are corroborated by every rancher in this room who has looked closely at his sick animals." Hargreaves looked at Kimball. "Mr. Kimball, do you dispute her identification of the disease?" Kimball shook his head slowly. "No, she told me exactly what it was before the county office even got involved. Everything she said checked out." Hargreaves looked at Parrish. "Same," Parrish said. Hargreaves made a note. Then he turned to Purcell. The room's attention followed. Purcell straightened in his chair. He had the look of a man about to do something uncomfortable that he'd been building up to for days. "Mr. Purcell," Hargreaves said, "you're the county assessor. You have some information relevant to this matter?" "I have documentation," Purcell said. His voice was steady but effortful. "Regarding a pending property assessment action filed 6 weeks ago concerning water rights on the North Creek corridor affecting Blackstone Ranch." He opened the leather folder on his knee and placed a set of papers on the table. "The action was filed by Wade Branson. The supporting argument in the filing references the disease situation in the valley and suggests that Blackstone Ranch's operations represent a liability to neighboring properties." The room went very still. "The filing was prepared," Purcell continued. "It was not finalized. I have not signed it." He looked at Gideon. "I want that on the record. I have not signed it, and I won't." Doyle looked at the papers, then at Purcell. "Why are you bringing this forward today?" Purcell looked at Martha. "Because the basis of the filing is false," he said. "The disease in this valley did not originate at Blackstone Ranch. The filing was prepared on the basis of that false premise, and I was—" He paused. "I was under pressure to finalize it before this review took place." "Pressure from whom?" Hargreaves said. "Wade Branson," Purcell said. He said it without looking away, which was the hardest part, and everyone in the room knew it. Branson's absence from the room became suddenly very loud. Hargreaves wrote something. He wrote for longer than seemed necessary for the number of words that would cover the fact. Then he set down his pen. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "the letter you sent to the State Livestock Board. You referenced a seller named Elias Gaunt in Prenter County." "Yes, sir." "And you have documentation from the Prenter County Veterinary Office confirming Gant's awareness of disease advisories prior to his sale." "Yes, sir. Fletcher's letter." Hargreaves looked at it again. "I know Fletcher. He's thorough." He looked up. "Mr. Branson is not present today." "No," Doyle said. He sounded like he had feelings about that. "Was he notified of this review?" "He was notified," Doyle said. "He declined to attend." Hargreaves absorbed that. "His formal complaint against Mrs. Calloway and Blackstone Ranch," Hargreaves said. "He submitted a withdrawal of that complaint yesterday afternoon?" "He did," Doyle said, "after the copies of Fletcher's letter were deposited at the county clerk's office." "The timing is—" "Yes." Hargreaves folded his hands on the table. "I'm going to be direct," he said, addressing the room. "The documentation before me establishes the following. The disease outbreak in this valley originated with livestock brought in from Prenter County by a buyer in this valley. The seller in Prenter County had knowledge of disease advisories before the sale. The outbreak has spread by insect transmission consistent with vesicular stomatitis, beginning in proximity to the property where the Prenter County animals were kept, and radiating outward in a pattern that has been accurately documented by Mrs. Calloway." He paused. The formal complaint filed against Mrs. Calloway and Blackstone Ranch was filed by the same individual whose property is at the center of the dispersal pattern, within hours of county officials observing that fact. The complaint was withdrawn after documentary evidence was secured in the county clerk's office. The room held its breath. The complaint is dismissed, Hargreaves said, with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled on the same grounds. Kimball let out a long, slow breath. Parrish was looking at his hat. Gideon was looking at Martha. She was sitting very straight, her hands flat on the table, her face doing nothing particular. But he had learned to read her somewhat by now, and he saw the slight tightening at the corner of her jaw. Not triumph, just the release of something that had been held a long time. Regarding Mr. Branson's property, Hargreaves continued, I'm ordering a formal state inspection of his livestock holdings. Any animals showing signs of disease must be quarantined. The matter of the Prenter County seller, Elias Gant, will be referred to state authorities, and the water rights filing Mr. Purcell has described will not be finalized, pending a review of the grounds on which it was submitted. Doyle was writing. His pen moved quickly, and he did not look up. One more thing, Hargreaves said. He looked at Martha directly. The management protocols you've been advising affected ranchers to follow. Isolation, wound care, soft feed, exercise. Are they consistent with standard VS management practice? Yes, sir, she said, based on documented recovery methods and my own experience with the 1871 outbreak. Any of the affected ranchers here seeing improvement in their animals? My roan mare turned around yesterday, Parrish said from the corner. He said it like a man who had been waiting for the chance to say it in the right room. Kimball? Hargreaves said. 2 of my 3 mares are improving, Kimball said. 3rd is still uncertain. Hargreaves nodded. He looked at Martha one more time. You should have had a formal education, he said. Not unkindly, just as an observation. I had a father who let me ask questions, she said, and a hard life. That covered most of the curriculum. A couple of the ranchers made sounds that might have been laughs, surprised out of them. The meeting broke up shortly after. There was paperwork, and Purcell had documents to formally withdraw, and Doyle had a report to complete, and the whole official machinery needed time to grind through its process. Gideon shook hands with Kimball and Sorensen and the others, and thanked Aldridge Sr., who waved it off and said he was doing it for the roan because he'd always liked that mare. He found Martha outside on the boardwalk, standing in the cold morning air with her coat buttoned to the neck, looking down the main street of town. The frost had melted off the boards, but the air still had the bite of it. He stood beside her. It's not finished, she said. No, he said. Branson will find a lawyer. It'll drag. He might find a way to complicate the state inspection. He might? And Gant in Prenter County will probably claim he didn't understand the advisories. Probably. She was quiet for a moment. But the pattern is on record, she said, and Purcell withdrew the filing, and the complaint is dismissed. She paused, and everybody in that room now knows exactly what happened and who did it. Yes, he said. A wagon went past on the street. The driver, a man. Gideon didn't know, glanced at them, and then looked back at Martha for a second longer than the glance required. Not with hostility, with a kind of uncertainty, the look of someone revising a picture they'd been given. Martha noticed. She usually noticed. They all heard what Branson was doing, she said. The men in that room, they've all had dealings with him. They knew who he was, some part of them knew, but it was easier to go along. She looked at the street. That's the thing about someone like that. It's not that people don't see it, it's that seeing it costs something, and most people aren't ready to pay until they have to. You paid it, Gideon said. I didn't have a choice, she said. When it's your name on the complaint, you don't get the option of looking away. He thought about that. That's not entirely true, he said. Plenty of people in your position would have packed up and moved on, found somewhere else. She looked at him sideways. I had a broken wagon wheel, she said. And there was something in the way she said it, dry and quiet, and with a thread of something underneath that wasn't quite a joke. Martha, he said. She waited. You could have had the wagon wheel fixed when you'd saved enough. You could have moved on from the shack. He kept his eyes on the street. Nobody was going to stop you. She was very quiet. No, she said. Nobody was going to stop me. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The cold air moved between the buildings. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Not Judge. Judge was at Aldridge's, but Martha glanced toward the sound anyway, the reflex of a person who has been keeping track of her people. Owen's going to want to hear everything, she said. He'll want to know what Hargreaves said specifically, Gideon said. He listens to official things very carefully. He's going to be a lawyer, Martha said. The certainty in her voice was the quiet certainty of a woman who has known something a long time. He doesn't know it yet, but he's going to be a lawyer. Gideon looked at her. How do you know? Because he asked questions about the rules of things, how a thing is supposed to work, what happens when it doesn't. She paused. He asked me last month why Branson was allowed to call the health office if he knew his own horses were the source. I told him I didn't know. He said someone should make a rule about that. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Someone probably should, he said. She almost smiled, not quite, but close. We should get back, she said. Owen will be climbing the walls at Aldridge's. Probably turned Judge into a law clerk by now, Gideon said. She did smile then. Small, and only for a second, but it was there. They went to get their horses. On the ride back, Gideon kept thinking about what she'd said on the boardwalk. Not the parts about Branson or the review, the part where he'd said nobody was going to stop you, and she'd said no, nobody was going to stop me, and neither of them had said the rest of it, which was the part that hung in the air between them for 11 miles of cold road back to Blackstone Ranch. He thought about the gate. He thought about how it had been shut for 6 years, and how he'd opened it without thinking when he saw her coming up the road with Ranger, and how he hadn't thought to close it again after that. He didn't know what that meant exactly. He was not a man who was good at the early stages of knowing what things meant, but he was fairly certain it meant something. He pulled up at the gate to let her through first, and she rode past him without ceremony, and Judge came bounding across the yard from the direction of the Aldridge place with Owen running behind him and calling his name in the exasperated way of someone whose dog has been waiting for this exact moment and has now ceased to listen to anything. Judge hit Martha's stirrup, and she laughed, actually laughed, a real sound, unguarded, and reached down to touch the dog's ridiculous flopped ear. Owen arrived at the gate out of breath. What happened? He demanded. Tell me everything. Start from when you walked in. Martha dismounted. Dismissed, she said, with prejudice. Owen looked at her. What does that mean? It means it's over, she said, and it means they can't try the same thing again. Owen was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then he grabbed Judge and hugged him with the ferocity of a boy who'd been holding something very carefully for a long time and had just been told he could put it down. Gideon closed the gate behind them. The days after the review had a different quality to them. Not easier, exactly. The work was the same. There was always work on a ranch in autumn, the particular pressured work of a season closing down, animals needing attention, equipment needing winterizing, wood needing splitting and stacking before the cold arrived in earnest. But the weight that had been sitting on the property for the past 2 weeks had shifted. Not gone. Shifted. Like a stone that has been moved off your chest and set down nearby. You're still aware of it, still breathing around it, but you can breathe. Gideon noticed it first in small things. Martha stopped checking the road when she came out of the shack in the morning. She'd been doing it without seeming to realize it, a quick scan east and west, the habit of a person expecting something unpleasant to arrive. The morning after the review, she came out and walked directly to the water pump without looking at the road at all, and Gideon was at the fence watching and noticed the absence of that scan, the way you noticed when a persistent sound finally stopped. Owen started talking more. He had always talked to his mother and to Judge and occasionally to Carl Aldridge, but he had maintained a careful reserve with Gideon that Gideon had respected without pushing. After the review, something loosened in the boy. He started appearing at the barn in the evenings when Gideon was doing the late feeding, not asking to help exactly, just being present, and gradually the presence turned into conversation. Questions about the horses, about how you knew which animals to breed, about the North Creek, and how water rights worked, about what Gideon had been doing for the past 6 years with the gate shut. That last question came out one evening when they were both leaning on the paddock fence watching Ranger move in the last of the daylight. The stallion fully recovered now, his coat gleaming, his stride easy and confident in the way of a horse who had come through something hard and knew it. My mother says you shut the gate because you lost someone, Owen said. He said it the way he said difficult things, directly, without warning, as if he'd decided the careful approach took longer and hurt about the same. Gideon looked at the horse. "My wife," he said. 6 years ago. What was her name? Eleanor. Owen thought about this. "Do you still miss her?" he asked. "Every day," Gideon said. "Less like a wound now. More like, you know how sometimes you reach for something that used to be in a certain place, and your hand goes there on its own, and then you remember it's not there anymore? It's more like that." Owen was quiet for a moment, watching Ranger. "My father died when I was 5, Owen said. "I don't remember his face. I remember his voice a little, and the way he smelled." He paused. "My mother kept his coat for 3 years. She gave it away in Wyoming. She said she kept reaching for it, and it wasn't helping her anymore." Gideon didn't say anything. "She doesn't talk about him much," Owen said. "But she says, she told me once, she said grieving is just love with nowhere to go. And eventually you have to find somewhere to put it." Gideon's hands rested on the top fence rail. The wood was cold under his palms. "She's right," he said. "She usually is." Owen looked at him sideways with the evaluating look that was so much his mother's it was sometimes startling. "She likes it here," Owen said. "She thinks the fence work is good and the pastures are underused and the creek water is cleaner than anywhere she's seen in years." "What about the shack?" Gideon said. "The floor's still cold." "She put down that rag rug she made from the old horse blankets," Owen said. "It's better." He paused. "She also fixed the window that was leaking air in the northeast corner. She didn't tell you about that." "I know," Gideon said. "I noticed. I didn't say anything because I thought you'd both rather I not make a thing of it." Owen seemed to find this satisfactory. "Judge likes it here too," he offered. "He has opinions about a lot of places and most of them are negative." "High standards," Gideon said. "Very," Owen agreed. They stood there a while longer while Ranger moved in the paddock, and the light went, and the cold came up from the ground the way it did in autumn, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with anything else. 3 days after the review, Hargreaves sent a letter. It arrived with the weekly mail delivery, and Gideon read it at the kitchen table and then walked it across the yard to Martha without being able to entirely keep what he was feeling off his face. She read it standing in the shack doorway. The State Livestock Board had conducted a preliminary inspection of Branson's property and confirmed 17 animals with signs of vesicular stomatitis, including several that were in advanced stages indicating the disease had been present longer than Branson had claimed to Doyle. The matter of Elias Gant in Prenner County had been forwarded to the state attorney's office for review of potential fraud in the sale of diseased livestock. And, the part that had changed Gideon's expression, the board was formally recommending that the county assessor's office conduct an audit of all water rights transactions in the valley involving Blackstone Ranch for the previous 5 years, given the conflict of interest identified in Purcell's testimony. Martha read it twice. Then she handed it back without saying anything and went inside and sat down. Gideon followed her to the doorway, but didn't go in. "That last part," he said, "the audit, that could recover the partial water rights Branson transferred 2 years ago." "I know," she said. "That was before you came. I didn't tell you about that one. He got Purcell to—" He stopped. "It's complicated." "You don't have to explain it now," she said. "I know." He held the letter. "I'm telling you because you should know. Because everything that's happened in this valley in the past month, everything that's changed, it didn't start with the disease. It started with someone deciding to look at the whole picture instead of just the piece they were handed." She looked at him from across the small room. "You're giving me credit," she said. "Not flattered by it, just identifying the thing." "I'm being accurate," he said. She looked at her hands. "I rode to 11 ranches," she said. "I wrote 3 letters. I sat in a room and told an official what I'd observed." She pressed her lips together. "Any person with eyes and the willingness to look could have done the same thing." "But they didn't," Gideon said. "And you did." She didn't answer that. "The wagon wheel," he said. "Dobbins said it would be ready by end of next week." Something shifted in the room. Gideon felt it before he understood it. Martha looked up at him. "I know," she said. "You've saved enough," he said. "From the fence work, the kitchen garden, you've got more than enough now for the wheel and the labor." "I know," she said again. The lamp on the small table was burning low and would need oil soon. Outside, Judge was barking at something in the east field. One bark, investigation, not alarm. Owen's voice told him to come back, and he did. "Martha," Gideon said. She waited. He was not good at this. He had never been good at this. At saying the thing directly when the thing was personal and large and could be refused. Eleanor had always said he communicated best through action, which was a kind way of saying he went quiet when the stakes were high. He knew it. He had spent 6 years in the particular silence of a man who stopped needing to say anything to anyone because there was no one to say it to. "I don't want you to go," he said. It came out without the shape he'd intended. Too simple, too plain. But there it was. Martha was very still. "Gideon, the shack is cold and the floor is cold even with the rug, and the northeast window doesn't seal right, even fixed," he said. "And Owen should have a real room, and the east pasture needs someone who understands horses better than I do to manage it through the winter." He stopped. "None of those are the reason I'm saying it." "I know," she said. "The reason I'm saying it, I know what the reason is," she said quietly. He looked at her. Her expression was not what he expected. Not closed. Not the careful distance she maintained by default. The posture of someone who had learned not to expect doors to stay open. She looked like someone who had been waiting for a particular thing to be said and was now in the uncomfortable position of having to decide what to do with it. "I'm 42 years old and I'm not small and I'm not easy," she said. "I have opinions about everything and I keep 3 copies of important documents and I talk to a one-eared dog like he's a person, and I fixed your window without asking because it needed fixing, and that's how I am about things that need doing." "I know," he said. "I have a son who needs stability more than he needs adventure," she said. "Who needs a place where he can put down roots and not wonder when the next town is." "I know. And I've been blamed for things my whole adult life because of how I look," she said. "And I'm done apologizing for how I look. I'm done making myself smaller. I'm done standing in doorways." "I haven't asked you to do any of those things," he said. "No," she said. "You haven't." She looked at him steadily. "That's the part I'm having trouble knowing what to do with." Outside, Judge barked again, and Owen shushed him with the elaborate patience of an 11-year-old who had appointed himself the dog's primary social handler. "Martha," Gideon said, "I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm asking you to stay. And if you stay, and the wheel gets fixed and you decide in the spring you want to move on, I'll help you load the wagon myself." He paused. "But I'd like the chance. I'd like both of us to have the chance." She looked at him for a long moment. She had dark eyes, and they were direct in the way her whole self was direct. Not aggressive, just honest, focused, looking at the thing in front of her without flinching from it. "The main house has 4 rooms," she said finally. "It does. Owen could have the east room." "He could?" "And I would need it to be clear," she said carefully, "that I'm not a housekeeper. I'm not a cook for hire. I'm not a transaction," he said. She stopped. "Yes," she said. "You're not," he said. "You haven't been since the day you came through that gate." She breathed out slowly. "Then yes," she said. "I'll stay." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a scene from someone's idea of a romantic story. It was 2 people in their 40s, both of whom had lived through loss and loneliness and the particular grinding difficulty of surviving years that hadn't been kind, saying something true to each other in a small, cold room with a dog barking outside and a lamp running low. That was the thing about real life. It didn't arrange itself into beautiful moments. It gave you a slightly too dim lamp and cold floors and a dog with poor timing, and the thing that mattered was said anyway, in the middle of all of that, and it was enough. The autumn settled into winter, and the winter was hard the way winters in the valley always were. Sudden cold snaps that lasted a week, ice on the North Creek that had to be broken for the animals, 2 feet of snow in December that kept everyone close to the house and the barn for 4 days straight. Owen got his east room and filled it gradually with things he collected. A smooth river stone, a crow feather, a book of legal proceedings that Carl Aldridge had lent him and that he read with the focused intensity of someone who had found their subject. Judge slept in front of the main house fireplace with the settled confidence of an animal who had identified the optimal position and intended to maintain it permanently. Martha moved her 2 trunks into the main house in October, and the line shack went back to being a storage building, and the kitchen of the main house became a place where two people cooked at the same time in the comfortable negotiation of individuals who had different methods and had decided to work around each other rather than arguing about the right way to do things. There were arguments. They were not a frictionless pair. Martha had strong opinions about how the horses should be rotated through the pastures, and Gideon had a system he'd been using for 8 years. And the conversation about it one November morning got loud enough that Owen and Judge both relocated to the barn until it was finished. They sorted it eventually, a compromise that was mostly Martha's approach, with one element of Gideon's stubbornness preserved, because she decided the hill wasn't worth dying on. She told him that directly. "I'm giving you the hay rotation," she said. "Don't make me regret it." He said he wouldn't. He did regret it once, in February, when he was wrong about the timing, and she didn't say "I told you so," which cost her something, and he knew it, and said "thank you," which was not something he said easily. The valley changed around them. Slowly, the way valley things changed, not through announcement, but through accumulation. Kimball's mares recovered fully by mid-November, all 3, including the one that had been uncertain. Parrish's roan had a harder time of it, but she was on her feet and eating well by December, and Parrish came by Blackstone at Christmas with a jar of something he'd put up from his kitchen garden and said almost nothing but stayed for an hour, and that said everything. Sorensen and his brother-in-law Vic lost 2 more cattle before the outbreak finished running its course, and they were bitter about it in the way of men who had calculated losses against expectations and found the gap unbridgeable. But they didn't blame Martha. The record was clear, and the record had been put in too many official places by too many official hands to be easily revised by anyone still inclined to look for a softer target. Branson's attorney made several attempts to complicate the state investigation. He was skilled and he was thorough, and he managed to delay things in the way that lawyers delayed things when their client had resources, and the other side had only the truth. But the state audit of the water rights transactions produced 2 transfers that Purcell formally identified as having been signed under duress, and the attorney's delays ran directly into that stone wall. And by January, the picture was clear enough that Branson's position in the valley had fundamentally changed. Not destroyed. Men like Branson rarely got cleanly destroyed. They shed cost and retreated and regrouped, but changed. The particular kind of authority that came from everyone believing you were untouchable depended entirely on everyone continuing to believe it, and once the belief broke, it didn't reassemble the same way. He sold 4 properties in the spring. The Blackstone water rights were restored in March through a county proceeding that lasted 3 hours and generated more paperwork than any of the ranchers had ever seen in one room. Gideon told Martha that evening. She was in the kitchen and he came in from the cold and sat at the table and told her, and she listened, and then she said, "Good," and went back to what she was doing, which was fixing the handle on the cast iron pot that had been loose since she arrived. He watched her work. "That's all?" he said. "Just good?" "What else is there?" she said. "It's how it should have been. It being how it should have been isn't cause for celebration. It's just right." He thought about that for a while. "You know," he said, "most people would feel like celebrating." "I'll celebrate when Owen passes the bar exam," she said. "This is just the water going back to where it belongs." He leaned back in the chair. "He's 11, Gideon said. "I know when he is," she said. "I was there." The handle was fixed. She set the pot down with the solid, definitive sound of something returned to its proper state. The thing that Gideon came to understand that winter, slowly and without any single moment of revelation, was something Martha had probably known for longer than he had, that the gate being shut hadn't actually protected him from anything. He'd believed it had. He'd believed that if you kept the perimeter closed, kept the world at a manageable distance, the pain inside the perimeter would stay contained and the pain outside couldn't get in, and you'd exist in a kind of suspended equilibrium that was not happiness, but was at least not more loss. But grief didn't work like that. It didn't care about gates. It traveled through fence lines and filled empty rooms and sat down at tables where no one else was sitting, and the gate only kept out the things that might have helped. He didn't say this to Martha. He didn't need to. She had come through a shut gate with his horse on a lead line, and she had stayed, and that was enough philosophy for one lifetime. He asked her to marry him in March. It was not a romantic evening. It was a practical Tuesday morning, and they were in the barn, and he was checking a fence post she'd flagged as potentially rotted, the same way she'd shown him to check, pressing the thumb against the base at the soil line, and he was thinking about how she'd taught him that, how she'd crouched down and shown him exactly where to press and what to feel for, and how she'd been right about that, and about most other things she'd put her judgment to. He straightened up from the post. "Martha," he said. She was 3 feet away looking at the next post in the line. "This one's fine," she said. "Marry me," he said. She turned around. She looked at him for a long moment. There was mud on her boots, and her coat was the same one she'd worn the day she arrived, mended twice since in different places, and her hair was doing the thing it did in cold weather, where it came loose on one side and she ignored it. "You have terrible timing," she said. "I know," he said. "We're in a barn." "I know." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Obviously?" he said. "Gideon," she said patiently, "I moved into your house in October." "I know, but I fixed your window without asking. I reorganized your hay rotation. I've been feeding your horses for 5 months, and I know all their names and their particular anxieties." "Ranger doesn't have anxieties," he said. "Ranger is afraid of the bucket with the broken handle," she said. "He has been since before you noticed. You're welcome." He looked at her. She almost smiled. The almost smile that was better, he had decided some months ago, than most people's full ones. "Yes," she said again, simply, finally, with the weight of a woman who meant exactly what she said and had thought about it long enough to be sure. Owen's reaction, when they told him at supper that evening, was to sit very still for a moment and then say, "Does this mean I can have a horse of my own?" Martha said, "We'll see." Owen translated this correctly as yes and went back to his food. Judge put his head in Gideon's lap, which he had never done before. Gideon put his hand on the dog's ridiculous flopped ear. "He likes you," Owen said, without looking up. "I thought he already liked me," Gideon said. "He approved of me back in October." "That was professional approval," Owen said seriously. "This is personal approval. It's different." Martha was looking at her plate, but her shoulders were moving. "Are you laughing?" Gideon said. "No," she said. "You are." "I'm not," she said, and she wasn't quite laughing, but she wasn't quite not. And the lamp was burning properly because Martha kept it filled, and the house was warm because Gideon had stacked the wood right, and Judge was a warm weight in Gideon's lap, and Owen was reading his legal proceedings book while nominally eating his supper, and that was what the evening looked like. Not perfect. Not a painting, just real and warm and full in the way that empty things sometimes became when the right people walked through the gate. They were married on a Saturday in late April, when the pastures had come back green and the creek was running high and clean from snowmelt, and the horses were in the east field in the morning light that came in low and gold over the hills. The neighbors came. Kimball came, and his wife, who had opinions about everything and said most of them out loud, which Martha appeared to find refreshing. Parrish came, quieter than usual, and brought his wife and his eldest daughter, who was 17, and spent 20 minutes asking Martha about the horses with an intensity that Martha recognized and responded to with the same directness she gave everyone. Sorensen came, and Vic, and Carl Aldridge, who had grown 6 months older and 4 inches more serious since his ride to Printer County, and was beginning to look like the man he was becoming. Old Aldridge Sr. stood in the yard and shook Gideon's hand for a long time without saying much, which was his way, and it was enough. Purcell came, which surprised Gideon. He came quietly, arriving late, standing at the edge of things. When he and Martha were briefly near each other, he said, "I should have stood up sooner." She said, "Yes, but you stood up." He nodded, and that was the end of it. She was not the kind of woman who required more. Owen stood up straight through the whole thing, wearing a jacket that Carl had lent him and that was slightly too large in the shoulders, and he shook hands with people and answered questions about school with the patient specificity of a boy who had already begun thinking about what came next. After, when the neighbors had gone and Owen had taken Judge for a last run around the property before dark, Martha and Gideon stood on the porch of the main house in the late light. The gate at the end of the drive was open. It had been open since October. Since before October, really, since the day he'd pushed it wide to let her through with Ranger and hadn't thought to close it after. "The gate," Martha said. "I was thinking about taking it off the hinges," Gideon said. She looked at him. "Entirely?" she said. "It doesn't serve much purpose," he said. "If someone's coming to this property, they're coming because there's something worth coming to. A gate that shuts doesn't change that. It just makes you feel like you're controlling something you're not actually controlling." She was quiet for a moment. Eleanor would have liked that reasoning, she said. She said it carefully, the first time she'd said Eleanor's name, testing the ground gently the way she tested fence posts, pressing at the base to see what was solid underneath. "She would have said it first," Gideon said. "I'm just catching up." Martha looked at the gate. "Leave it on the hinges for now," she said, "in case of the cows." He looked at her. "The Kimball cows got out twice last fall and came through here," she said. "If we have no gate at all, we'll be sorting them out of the south pasture every time the wind blows." He thought about this. "You're right," he said. "I'm usually right about gates," she said. He looked at her sideways. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the pasture, at the horses moving in the evening light, at the green valley that had been trying to take this ranch apart for 6 years through weather and loneliness, and one ambitious man with a silver pin on his lapel, and hadn't managed it. The thing about Martha Calloway, Martha Mercer now, and she'd said that plainly when Purcell asked and hadn't hesitated, was that she had never arrived anywhere expecting to be welcomed. She had learned, somewhere in the hard years between losing her husband and finding this broken gate, that the world had a strong preference for blaming people who couldn't fight back, for finding the person most available to absorb someone else's failure, for choosing the easiest shape to push around. She had also learned, and this was the thing that mattered, the thing that had brought her up that road with Ranger and kept her through the winter and put her name on county documents and placed 3 copies of important letters in 3 different locations. That knowing the world worked that way was not the same as accepting it. You didn't have to make yourself smaller because someone needed you to be smaller. You didn't have to step back from your own truth because the truth was inconvenient for someone with more authority than you. You didn't have to pretend the gate was there when it had been standing open all along, waiting for someone with the courage to walk through it and the stubbornness to stay. Gideon had built a fence around his grief and called it protection, and it had protected him from nothing except the ordinary human business of being known by someone. Martha had spent 20 years being seen as a silhouette, just a shape, the heavy widow, the inconvenient woman, the easy target, by people who couldn't be bothered to look at what was actually standing in front of them. They had both, in their different ways, been shut in. And then a stallion had gone missing in a storm, and a woman with 73 cents and a broken wagon wheel had appeared on a road in autumn, and the gate had opened, and the whole equation of the place had changed. The evening light went long and amber over the pastures. Ranger was moving in the east field, easy and unhurried, exactly as a horse should move who has been properly fed and properly shod and has come home from wherever the storm took him. "Owen's going to want supper," Martha said. "He's always going to want supper," Gideon said. "Judge has been angling for the leftover biscuits since noon. Judge has been angling for things since the day he arrived. I respect the consistency." She pushed off the porch rail. She was not a graceful woman, not in the conventional sense. She moved with the practical efficiency of someone who had long since stopped worrying about how the moving looked, and she was going into the house to make supper on the day of her own wedding, because that was the kind of woman she was, and it needed doing, and she was the one who knew where everything was. Gideon watched her go inside. Then he walked down the drive to the gate and took hold of it and swung it fully open, wide as it would go, the hinges complaining after years of disuse in both directions. He didn't take it off. Martha was right about the Kimball cows, but he swung it open and stood there for a moment, looking out at the road, the same road she'd come up 6 months ago, leading a horse she'd found in a field, because it needed leading home, because that was what she did with things that needed doing. And he thought about how strange it was, the whole shape of it, how a man could lock something up to protect it and end up just imprisoning himself. How the thing he'd been keeping out was the exact thing that had always been the point. The road was empty in the evening light. Behind him, from inside the house, he heard Martha's voice say something to Owen, and Owen's voice answer, and then Judge made a sound of strong opinion about the biscuits, and Owen laughed, and that sound came through the open door and crossed the yard and reached Gideon at the gate, like something warm in the cold air. He turned around and went home.